Welcome to the Nixon Seminar. I'm Hugh Hewitt, president of the Nixon Foundation. We're pleased to welcome tonight three new members of the seminar, Dr. Monica Crowley, Dr. Nadia Shadlow, and Congressman Michael Waltz. They're joining our 12 other members and our co-chairman, former Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Ambassador O'Brien and Secretary Pompeo are joined by a special guest tonight, entrepreneur and author Peter Thiel. And I turn it over to you, Mr. Secretary.
Great, Hugh. Thank you. Peter, thanks for joining us. It's great to be with everyone this evening. We look forward to a wide open discussion on a range of things that impact high-tech America, national security, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about China and the Chinese Communist Party, I am sure. Peter, I thought I'd start off tonight with just a general question. You spent a lot of time, I've read most of what you've written, you spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the technology fight between the West and the ideas that the Chinese Communist Party puts forward, whether that's disinformation or the capacity to move digits around the world, and they now have a full-on digital currency that they are deploying. Give us all your sense of where we sit today. If we were to draw up the assets and liabilities for the West and for the Chinese Communist Party, how would you evaluate the relative positions across various technology spaces?
Wow, it's a pretty broad question. I think, I think that in many ways we are in most areas we're still ahead of China, and we are still far more innovative. I think innovation happens in the West, and shockingly little innovation happens in China. But they have been very good at copying things, stealing things, and to some extent, if China is able to just catch up, there is a way in which it will become a more powerful country. China has 4 times the population of the U.S., and so if you converge and China gets to parity on productivity, on technology, you'll have 4 times the GDP and maybe 4 times the military, and it will be the dominant power. So parity means the West is losing, means the U.S. is losing at parity.
Of the technology, if you took AI or machine learning or blockchain, how much of that did they create? How much of that have they stolen from the West? Do you have a sense for those?
Well, I think again, those aren't the only two possibilities. I think I don't think they created very much. I think a lot of it was just handed over from the West, so it was not even stolen. I criticized Google a few years ago for refusing to work on its AI technology on Project Maven with the U.S. military, but working with Chinese universities and Chinese researchers. And since everything in China is sort of a civilian military fusion, Google was effectively working with the Chinese military, not with the American military. And there's sort of this question: why was Google doing this? And one of the things that I sort of was told by some of the insiders at Google was they figured, they might as well give the technology out through the front door, because if they didn't give it, it would get stolen anyway. So it doesn't quite count as theft, but it's quasi-theft.
Co-opted, yes. Robert?
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. So one of the things that we've seen, and it's happened faster than I think the experts anticipated, especially over the past decade, is that the Chinese military and the naval services have closed the gap on the U.S., both in terms of quantity, but in also quality, much faster than expected. So the gap, I agree with you, I think we still have an edge, but the gap is getting smaller. They've done things, they're looking at their military platforms the way maybe Silicon Valley or industry would look at a product. So there's iterative manufacturing and design,
Right.
Beta testing, constantly upgrading. And we're looking at what the Pentagon does, where we have these pristine processes that take decades to get to a platform that's perfect or near perfect. But it's taken us forever to get the products designed and then eventually deployed, and at a very high expense. What does the Pentagon need to do to keep the edge, and also to fix procurement, in some ways, to make sure that the Chinese don't catch up the way they appear to be doing relatively quickly?
Yes, well, I think the procurement question is obviously a very broad question, but I think what was healthy about the military industry complex in the U.S., was relatively healthy about it during the Cold War, was we had some balance of bigger companies and a lot of smaller companies in the ecosystem, and I think big companies are generally good at doing things at scale. Small companies are generally better at innovating and coming out with new products. And you want some ecosystem that has a blend of both kinds of companies. And I think what happened in '89 after the Cold War ended was there was a shrinking of military budgets, but there was also an incredible consolidation of the defense industry. And the consolidation actually meant that the money was spent less efficiently, especially with respect to R&D. And so we spent less money and less efficiently, and so there was some massive decline in the effectiveness of the system in the '90s. I think there have been various attempts over the last half decade to reform the procurement process, to figure out ways to fund smaller companies, to do to allocate some R&D to all these different projects. I think we've improved some, but it has to be sort of an integrated process. You don't want to just get a $5 million DARPA grant where what you invent gets stuck in a broom closet in the Pentagon. It has to somehow, you have to be able to get to a pilot that scales, and it has to be integrated into the whole procurement process. And there's just all these risk-averse things where you're probably if you're working in the Defense Department, it's always safe to go with IBM or something like that, but it never works.
Putting these together in some way, in terms of how this technology moves. In a good year, 2019, there were 360,000 Chinese students studying at American universities. There were less than 30,000 Americans studying at Chinese universities, in-country, in Chinese universities. Make any sense?
Well, it's we're an open society. They're not open in any way. It's just incredibly. I spent some time in China in 2015, 2016. My book on startups did actually surprisingly well, so I did this two-week book tour. But it is, there's sort of crazy ways if you just drive around Beijing, where you have all these, military, paramilitary, militarized police. They're defending themselves against their own population. So even within China, things are segmented, closed off in all sorts of ways. And then even though there are some number of Westerners in there, it's also as a ratio. So 30,000 in a population of 1.4 billion versus 360,000 in a population of 330 million. So it's not 10 to 1. It's actually maybe 40 to 1 adjusted for population.
Yeah, that's the question kind of as a policy matter. So you think about capital, deploying capital. You think about where to invest in the best ideas, the most innovative technologies. We have a whole bunch of students who are coming here who are either going to go back or stay and work here, become part of the U.S. workforce for often large U.S. companies, but sometimes small U.S. companies. And the question is well taken. We are, in fact, an open country. I think that makes it riskier to have those students studying here because the capacity for that information to end up in places that benefits the Chinese Communist Party's model, its ideology, is pretty significant. And just as you stare at workforce issues here in the United States, and there was a president trying to figure out what the right policy was, do you have any thoughts for how they should begin to think about that?
Yeah, I think you're basically right that you want to be in the more restrictive zone. It's quite hard to do anything given where a lot of the university leadership is sort of in a completely deranged space on this, where they think of graduate students as sort of indentured servants, cheap, underpaid labor, and maybe the Chinese grad students are actually less demanding and are willing to get paid less or something. And there are all sorts of weird ways that the universities have not been very helpful. And I think we should just be putting a lot of pressure on them. You should be looking at, are they getting money from Chinese funding? I think some of that, and there's probably been a lot of abuse on this in various ways. And
now, Peter, following up on Mike's question, which I think there's a consensus now that AI and quantum computing are the new high grounds, or at least will be the high grounds for the future. And I think there's still a consensus that we have an edge in both those areas.
Yes.
Although again, it's a diminished edge over where it was a few years back. What's your advice to the Biden administration? How do we stay ahead on quantum and AI? Keeping in mind that we're an open society and we've got all these graduate students here and that sort of thing. What do we need to do to stay in the forefront? Because my concern is if we fall behind, we lose the high ground. We're going to be in for a rough spell.
Yeah, the thing that I would say is tricky about AI is that there are a lot of aspects of the technology that I think we don't actually want to be pursuing too much because it's AI is what you need for a surveillance society. Right. I've had this riff where people often say crypto or Bitcoin is a vaguely libertarian technology. I mean, technology's politically neutral, but it can still be crypto's sort of, if crypto's kind of libertarian, then AI is kind of communist. And so even though we're ahead from the basic science of AI, China is willing to apply it. It's willing to turn the entire society into a face recognition surveillance state that's far more intrusive, far more totalitarian than even Stalinist Russia was. And that's something we're not willing to do. So it's a very two-edged thing in that way.
And let me follow up on that question, Mike, if I can
Yeah, of course.
jump in. So what do these folks do? I mean, we've got authoritarian countries now. The PRC is the lead example, but you've got others, Russia, that are going to be able to employ these high-tech tools to create this total surveillance society. Something beyond even Orwell. When you go back and read 1984, it seems a little quaint right now. How are those people going to defeat the high-tech tools that are oppressing them or that are surveilling them? And how did they ever win back their freedom or their liberty if a government's willing, a regime's willing to use those tools the way we've seen the PRC and others employ them? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. Certainly, in the 1980s, I had the view that the Soviet Union could never be reformed from within, and that even the Eastern Bloc countries would never, that it was high tech enough that you had the secret police with guns, and they could break up any nascent protest, and it would never change. So there's certainly, the history of the late 80s suggests there's more possibility than we think, and it's always, there probably are ways in which the Chinese government's certainly not acting like the technologies are that straightforward. They're reinforced with concentration camps and lots of police and lots of secret police. But yeah, it's not obvious how you change that at all. And this is and it is it's not developing at all in the way that people thought it was going to. One of the, and I think this is, I'd be interested in getting your guys' view on this, but one thought I always have is, why did it take us so long to wake up to the threat of China, to the way it was not becoming a liberal democracy, and why were we able to tell ourselves all these fictional stories in the West for so long? And the crazy thought experiment I have on it was that if Tiananmen had happened 1 year later, we might have woken up 27 years earlier. So when Tiananmen happened in June of 1989,
Right,
you had Brent Scowcroft from the Bush 41 administration went to China and said, don't worry about it because you're anti-Soviet and that's what matters.
Right.
And then
had it happened 2 years later.
Or even 1 year later.
Yeah.
We might have come to our senses, 27 years earlier or something like that.
Yeah. Look, I think that's right. I think there's a lot of theories out there. In the end, it was easy. We believe we destroyed the Soviet Union. We were right about that, and so who needs another long twilight struggle, right? Who needs to go fight that? And so for a long time, and deep commercial interest became connected to continuing this.
That's of course very different from the Soviet Cold War conflict, where there was very little economic overlap.
Think of everyone who thought, if I could sell, one hamburger to every Chinese person, I could sell 1 billion hamburgers a year. I mean, that's kind of the, fill in the blank with the product. But it was such an allure. The market was so attractive, I think, to American business folks that those commercial interests caused people to tell themselves a story that just wasn't true.
The cheap supply chains for Walmart or Apple.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had just one more question. But a comment to your point about we didn't know. I remember I was a young soldier patrolling the East German border in 1989 and literally left 2 weeks before the wall came down. We had no earthly idea it was coming down 2 weeks on. I watch the Chinese. I watch how they respond when we talk about the Chinese Communist Party as separate from the country of China itself. It's fragile, whether it's Tibet or Mongolia or Taiwan or Hong Kong. They know, and that's why the surveillance state has to be so strong.
How good of a model do you think we currently have at all of what's going on in China? Is Xi like in absolute control? Are there lots of factions that might overthrow him any day?
I think with all these things, I think we have a pretty good understanding, but there's no. I think of this in the Middle East. We think we know what's going on, and the reality is it's so much more complex, so much more tribal, so much more intricate than we can ever fully appreciate from the outside. As hard as we work on it, I think we often miss things. That's why we didn't see the fall of the Soviet Union coming. It's why you see these moments where the intelligence community in the U.S. and the West just can't get it right.
Although Xi seems to have he seems to have a very serious grasp on power, and the early corruption purges were clearly a cover for getting rid of political rivals, and he seems pretty unrivaled right now. I mean,
Yes.
that may not be the case, but that's all appearances are that he's got a stranglehold on power.
And we
in
should take him
China.
at his word for his intentions.
Yeah.
I thought I'd get one that comes to technology. It's a narrower question than where I began. So our team spent a lot of time thinking about semiconductors and the ecosystem around it and the manufacture of semiconductors. I went back this week, you'd sent a note out, and I went back and reread then Nixon-Kennedy debates, where they were debating these two little islands off the coast of China that are part of Taiwan formerly, in deep, intricate debates. Taiwan is even more central today to the high-tech infrastructure for the world, TSMC itself,
Yes.
and all of the subsidiary technologies around
Yes.
it. I wonder what your sense is. So we have a policy. It's our one China policy and the communiques that flow from it. The Trump administration largely stayed with that. Give me your sense of what would happen if that were upended. Not necessarily through military force, right? We didn't steal it. If it's coerced into those semiconductors not being available and that the high-end semiconductors not being as readily available to the West. What's your sense, and how should the private sector think about that as well?
Well, I think there are basically two cutting-edge semiconductor manufacturers. It's Taiwan Semiconductor and Samsung. And there were probably something like 30 semiconductor companies that were cutting edge 20 years ago,
Right.
Or 30 years ago. And so it's gotten a lot more expensive, so these scale economies. And then you have these questions about, how many semiconductors do you need that are really cutting edge versus how many can be these, more cheap, mass-produced things. But yeah, probably, if you need if we're gonna have a self-driving car, that probably will require a cutting-edge semiconductor, and that's where, there's probably some weird way in which, from an economic point of view, you can almost think of Taiwan as just this one company. It's Taiwan Semiconductor, and then the political questions are who really controls the company? Is it does the Chinese Communist Party have hooks into it, or are they still more scared of them? But somehow the board corporate politics of Taiwan Semiconductor are probably in some ways a proxy for all of Taiwan.
Yeah.
So it would be very, and I think Samsung is probably the other one in the mix. One of the very strange dynamics in Silicon Valley is people don't do very much with semiconductors anymore. I'm a venture capitalist. I get pitched on semiconductor startups every few years, but then it's always, I haven't done that much with it. I don't really know what's going on. It seems very expensive, very complicated. And I think one of the weird problems with 20 years of intellectual property theft, or where IP doesn't really have as much value as it used to, is that you learn not to invest in things like that. And you can think of consumer internet, which has been the be-all and end-all for tech investing in the U.S. for the last quarter century, as the kind of thing you invest in a world where there are no intellectual property rights. Because consumer internet, there are these companies, they're brands, they network effects, and you get to scale, and then even if people copy you, they can never take it over. Whereas semiconductors are in a very different zone.
That's
I think we're
very
still,
interesting.
I think we're still ahead of it in a lot of ways on the design side. And so it is one of the places where I think we can do more to block China than they can do to block us. But we've lost a lot of ground in the last 20 years.
That's interesting.
Well, I think we did that at the end of the Trump administration. I worked with Commerce and State, and really, in fact, when I first took office as National Security Advisor, everyone said the Huawei fight's over, we've lost. We decided, Mike and Wilbur and Larry Kudlow and I got together and decided we haven't lost, and we were using the design tools and some other things. We were able to put a crimp on Huawei, and now I think 29 of 30 Western democracies in Europe, plus Japan, Australia, India, others have moved away from Huawei and want trusted providers. And
So does
and
that
so
mean-
it
does
so
that
it showed
not-
that we had some. It did show we had some leverage still.
Does that? So I would say in general we're, China's at best at parity, mostly still behind us. Huawei may be the one exception, at least with all the subsidies they've given the company. What do you think the alternative to Huawei is? Is it Ericsson and Nokia, or is it, which I think of as not great, slightly sclerotic companies, but maybe that's the best we can do? Or my sort of Luddite answer is that maybe we should just say that the 5G technology is overrated and we can be a little bit slower in rolling it out, even though you can never say that in public, seemingly.
Yeah, so I think actually both those answers are correct. I don't think we have to be quite as fast as we thought we did, but I look at a company like Rakuten in Japan, which is not I mean, we were out, Mike and Larry and even the president, we were out pushing Ericsson, Nokia, and Rakuten, these not American companies. Would have been nice if we had one, but I think Dell is doing some interesting things. I think Microsoft is doing some interesting things. So, and I think the technology with some of these radio towers and radio devices that are small and inexpensive and can be swapped in and out like servers are now, I think it has the potential to leapfrog what Huawei is doing. And so I'm pretty bullish on it. But I think it will take a little bit more time. The problem is going to be, and you hit the nail on the head, Peter, is that in countries in Africa and Latin America where there's zero money, whether, even if the technology that the West develops is less expensive, which I think it will be, if the Chinese Communist Party is coming in and saying, we'll give you a free Huawei 5G kit, or we'll take a loan that you can repay with opaque terms and put you in a debt trap, but you can have your 5G today and you can pay us back 20 years from now when we take your railroad stock and we take your mines and that sort of thing. It is attractive to take the Huawei if someone's offering it to you for free, or apparently it's free. And as we know, there's nothing free, and these countries are going to give up a lot of sovereignty by taking the Huawei equipment. But for certain countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, it's going to be it's going to be hard to say no.
It's very appealing.
And just on one other area of the whole tech stacks, we're covering a lot of ground here. Mike, maybe I'll ask you, and how do you think about the space race that's sort of emerging, with, to some extent Russia, but even more with China, and where, they're sort of launching all these killer satellites and maybe space weapons, or, and a lot of this, of course, is, very classified.
Yeah, a lot of it's classified, and there's a lot of people that know more about it than I do. But suffice it to say, here's a data point that's useful. In 2019, the Chinese launched more missiles than the rest of the world combined. Those are tests, right? They just have the resources, the scale of what they're doing to work to put up the right satellites, to work to make sure they've got the capability is staggering, and they are moving very, very quickly. And so I don't want to say much about where we are from a parity perspective, but there will be an enormous amount of energy and resources put into place so that whenever there's a conflagration somewhere in the world, doesn't have to be a global one, that space will be able to generate an awful lot of leverage and an awful lot of power for some country who gets this most right.
And then maybe another question on the war gaming, where part of the thing that's very strange is China has these sort of newfangled weapons that haven't really been tested out. So they have will hypersonic missiles destroy U.S. aircraft carriers, or will their satellites be able to knock out our satellites, or and I'm not exactly sure how well it can be gamed out even by the Chinese side, since a lot of the stuff has never been tried.
If you want to take a shot, Rob, and talk about it.
How should one think about that? Are they going to be deterred because it's so newfangled that they won't quite know that it works, or will it embolden them into telling some heroic story how they're going to win without taking any casualties at all?
Look, it could be both at the same time, right? So number one, I remember a few years back calling Buzz Aldrin, who we had out here at the library not too long ago, to ask him, he was known as Dr. Rendezvous at NASA. I said, how easy will it be for one of these DF-21 or these Dongfeng missiles to take out an aircraft carrier? And he goes, the problem is the aircraft carrier is moving, and the missile, you've got to, it's a pretty tough shot. On the other hand, if the Chinese build enough of them and saturate, a zone, it may be tougher, even a fast-moving aircraft carrier to avoid a missile. Look, the way to deter the Chinese, when you talked about the technology theft and the copying, all of the hypersonic technology that the Chinese have and are now deploying, and their missiles was stolen from us, or obtained in gray market or open source by open source means. And during the Obama administration, when we stopped doing our hypersonic research and deployment, the Chinese leapt ahead. One of the things that was really a triumph of the last administration was refunding the military. We've got the Chinese have sophisticated weapons. We've got some pretty sophisticated weapons ourselves. But what we need to do, peace through strength works, and we need to get those platforms deployed, not just do the research on them and talk about them, but we've got to get them deployed. So We have to put the Chinese at risk right now. They're putting us at risk. We've got to put their airfields, we've got to put their ships, we've got to put their launch sites at risk the way they're doing ours with the weapons that they're deploying quickly. At the end of the day, I'd take our qualitative edge, any day over theirs. But we do have to continue to fund the DoD, and we've got to make sure that these cutting edge weapons that we've done a great job developing actually get deployed and aren't just, as you talked about earlier, sitting in a room closet at the Pentagon, but they're actually out in the field.
Maybe we'll send it. Hugh, have you got some folks out there that would like to provide some questions to Peter?
Michael Waltz. Congressman, you have the floor.
Hey, thanks, Hugh. Can you hear me okay?
We do.
Oh, hey, well, great to be with you. Robert, great to see you. Mike, great to see you. Man, we miss you guys in DC. Oh my God. I used to say Afghanistan was tough, but there are days these days. Look, Peter, thanks so much for joining us. I come at this with a business background, but also I'm sitting now as the ranking Republican on our research and technology committee, also in space and armed services. And we've discussed a lot, obviously, how the IP theft that is either being IP that's being handed over, the IP that's being stolen through cyber and through other means. I'm very interested in your thoughts, putting on your venture capital hat, on how we block and tackle and fence what's going on in the M&A world. We're seeing companies, small, medium, and large, whether they're chip manufacturers, CRISPR technology, advanced materials, really down the shopping list, that are getting gobbled up through M&A. Services industry is doing quite well on it. Of course, we have CFIUS, but that is frankly hugely under-resourced, and I think really only scratching the tip of the iceberg. DoD, the Defense Department, just rolled out a trusted capital mechanism, but that's really a process and it's a vetting process. What I'm interested in is what, from your perspective, you think we can do either legislatively or, importantly, from a technology standpoint. I've attended a number of presentations. We're looking at how AI can follow the money, can look at beneficial ownership, and help us understand the money flows into the venture capital world, so that we can protect some of these technologies. Again, particularly from my vantage point as the head Republican on research and tech subcommittee. Hey, thanks so much, and I'll mute and hand it over to you, Peter.
Yes, well, I think I think that there's sort of a lot of nuance to this, but to first approximation, you want to have make it harder for Chinese investors to invest in the U.S., and perhaps we should also make it a little bit harder for American investors to invest in China, because I think one of the ways that sort of the political game theory, the political economy, would always works is that we have these U.S. investors that invest in China that become a big constituency for open capital flows.
Yeah.
For doing this, I think sort of there's a decent part of the Wall Street crowd is pretty bad in this regard, and so I would dial it back on both sides, and maybe making it harder for U.S. investors to invest in China is an almost equally important part of this.
Hey, Mary Kissel, you are next.
We are funding our greatest adversary, both through our capital flows, but then through what we're handing over. So certainly welcome any follow-on ideas you have.
Okay, Mary Kissel.
Thanks, Hugh. Peter, thanks for joining us. Robert and Secretary, it's great to be with you. It just occurs to me that we're assuming that maybe the viewing audience knows why we care so much about this. It might just want to say we deal with a lot of authoritarian regimes, but there's only one that has the capability to dominate, and that's China. Peter, it seems like they're in a tech war with us, but we're not really in a tech war with them yet. And they have certain advantages, particularly on the big data front, in that they can command the collection of an enormous amount of data that's fundamental to AI, also from countries that they dominate in their near, abroad, and elsewhere. They're also collecting through illicit means. How do we compete with that? Do we need a free world coalition on the data front? And secondly, and I think this was implied earlier, is there a way to innovate around it? You were talking about 5G, does Starlink kind of make that obsolete? These are difficult questions, but maybe tackle those too. Thank you.
Your voice got turned off here. Well, I think I got the first parts of that question. I do think that seeing China in an adversarial way would be a helpful start, and Silicon Valley has not been that good on this. Although it's it's in some ways it's structurally better than Wall Street or Hollywood or the universities, because Silicon Valley for the most part has been frozen out of China, and so it's not. It doesn't naturally believe that it can get that much out of it. If you look at the big five tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, virtually very, very little presence in China, and so they aren't naturally a pro-China constituency. Apple is probably the one that's structurally a real problem, because the whole iPhone supply chain gets made from China, and Apple's the one that has real synergies with China. But then there is something about the woke politics inside these companies, the way they think of themselves is not really American companies, and it's somehow very, very difficult for them to have a sharp anti-China edge of any sort whatsoever. At Facebook, I'll give an example. There were, you had with the Hong Kong protests a year ago, the employees from Hong Kong were all in favor of the protests and free speech, but there were more employees at Facebook who were born in China than who were born in Hong Kong, and the Chinese nationals actually said that it was just Western arrogance, and you shouldn't be taking the Hong Kong side and things like that, and then the rest of the employees at Facebook sort of stayed out of it, but the internal debate felt like people were actually more anti-Hong Kong than pro-Hong Kong.
Peter, let me follow up on that.
And that's kind of, you have kind of these weird cultural things inside these companies.
Let me follow up with a question on that. So in Silicon Valley, we've got, it's very woke, in industry in general, about what's happening here. And yet it's not very woke as to what's happening to the Uyghurs, what's happening to the Tibetans, what's happening to the Democrats with a small d in Hong Kong, the threats against Taiwan, where you've got indigenous people. I mean, Taiwanese, many of them are indigenous to Taiwan. So there seems to be less concern about those folks in Silicon Valley and industry in general than the concern for kind of woke progressive politics here. What's driving that, and how do they get their conscience back when it comes to folks around the world, maybe even victims of environmental disasters?
There are all sorts of things one could say. It's like if you're concerned about climate change, maybe the tariffs the Trump administration put on China were way too small. They should be much higher, because it's all a carbon tax. Even the electric cars in China are dirty because they use coal power. They're dirtier than oil-powered cars in China. And so yes, I think but it somehow is very difficult to talk about this stuff coherently. I had a set of conversations with some of the Google people on the DeepMind AI technology, where is your AI being used to run the concentration camps in Xinjiang? And well, we don't really know, and don't ask any questions, and you have this almost magical thinking that by pretending that everything's fine, that's how you engage and have a conversation, and you make the world better. And it's some combination of wishful thinking, it's useful idiots, it's CCP fifth columnist collaborators. So it's some superposition of all these things. But yeah, look, I think if you think of it ideologically, or in terms of human rights or something like that, I'm tempted to say it's just profoundly racist. It's like saying that because they look different, they're not white people, they don't have the same rights. There's something super wrong. But I don't quite know how you unlock that.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Mary Kissel. I think you had a follow-up, Mary?
Yeah, sorry, just two questions. How do we get around their big data collection advantage, Peter, technically? And two, are there areas where you think we can innovate around them? Thanks.
Well, I don't think they have a technical advantage. I think it's more of an ideological advantage, that in a totalitarian communist society, you have no qualms about getting data on everybody in every way in every way possible. And that's what I think makes AI, a very tricky technology, where even if we're ahead in theory, there are a lot of ways we don't actually want to apply it in the U.S. or in the West, and they will apply it and get some advantages from it. I think the hope is always that it doesn't give you that much of an advantage. Does big data? How much does big data really tell you about things? Now, there's certain kinds of things it can tell you stuff about, but I don't think it makes as much of a difference as people want, beyond maybe having sort of all these communist control mechanisms on a society. But yeah, there's some places where we probably shouldn't even be trying to compete.
Let's go to John Burks now. John, you're up.
Thank you, Hugh. Peter, could you talk just a little bit about concretely what we should be doing to improve technology adoption at the Pentagon? Because obviously none of us want to have sort of our technological edge sitting in a closet someplace at the Pentagon, but how do we actually move to really deploying it?
Well, I'll just repeat what I said earlier, which is that I think big companies are better at doing things at scale. Small companies are better at innovating, and to the extent that we need to innovate, you need to figure out a way for a slightly larger fraction of the pie to go to startup companies, mid-sized companies, new companies with technologies, and there has to be a way for it to be an integrated procurement where you can get a pilot, and then there's a pathway for, if the pilot works, for it to scale rapidly and get adopted rapidly. And then the sort of opposite version of that we have now is that you can only deploy things where you've been buying something from a customer for a decade or something, and you have these sort of chicken and egg type rules, which mean that no new person can ever break in. And the big defense primes have in many ways gotten to be a little bit more sclerotic, less innovative over time, and it's very hard to correct that. But that would be the one, the thing I would zero in on. There obviously are just all these different areas where we have set programs on, like, building more aircraft carriers, which maybe we should be doing less of, and we should be doing more in innovative new areas, and that's always very hard to do because the set programs have a constituency around them. You can't disrupt that easily. So when you have a growing defense budget, you probably have more room for innovation. One of the worries I have is that the defense budget will probably not grow that much in the next few years, and then these innovation challenges are going to be much harder. And we'll have the risk is that we have a repeat of what happened at the end of the Cold War, where the budgets got cut, but the innovation got cut a lot more.
Christopher Cox.
Thanks, Hugh. Peter, it's great to be on this panel with you. I just want to start off with a point that your leadership at Palantir and your policies that you've put in place to say that Palantir won't deal with countries that aren't on good terms with the United States. That is such a great leadership position you've taken in Silicon Valley, and I really commend you for that, because I think that's going to be the big issue. Where does big tech fall in this divide with China and the United States? So I commend you for that. And my question is regarding digital currency. We've seen recently in the last few days that China has proposed creating their own digital currency. And I was wondering, how much of a threat is that to the dollar, to the dollar and its dominance of world markets? And if it is a threat, what can we do about it?
Well, I think there's sort of a lot of different kinds of things that fall under digital currency. Presumably the sort of electronic forms of money China envisions are ones where things can be monitored, again, even more granular, in an even more granular way than they're being monitored currently. The geopolitical thing I sort of wonder about is always that the U.S. dollar is a reserve currency of the world. There are some things about that are good for the U.S., some things that are more problematic. From China's point of view, they want to get, they don't like the U.S. having this reserve currency because it gives us, a lot of leverage over, Iranian oil supply chains and all sorts of things like that. They don't want the renminbi to become a reserve currency, because then you have to open your capital account and you have to do all sorts of things that they really don't want to do. I think the euro, you could think of as, was in part a Chinese weapon against the dollar. It didn't, in the last decade, it hasn't quite worked out that way, but that was, China would have liked to see two reserve currencies like the euro. And, even though I'm sort of a pro-crypto, pro-Bitcoin maximalist person, I do wonder whether at this point Bitcoin is also, should also be thought in part as a Chinese financial weapon against the U.S., where it threatens fiat money, but it especially threatens the U.S. Dollar, and China wants to do things to weaken it. So it's sort of, China is long Bitcoin, and perhaps from a geopolitical perspective, the U.S. should be a little bit be asking some tougher questions about exactly how that works. But some internal stable coin in China, that's not a real cryptocurrency. That's just that's just some sort of totalitarian measuring device.
Venmo for the communists.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, are you going to comment on that? That story made the front page of the Journal this morning, or Mr. Ambassador, about China wanting to start their own Bitcoin. What do you think about that?
So if I understand what they're doing is they're digitizing their currency. So separate from Bitcoin, it's still fiat currency, right? That is still Chinese money that they are now digitizing. It has huge impacts for their surveillance capacity. They would pitch it as anti-fraud. You can prevent fraud from taking place. I suppose that's true. This is something I think they believe will reduce the costs of cross-border transactions as well for the Chinese. Your point about not wanting to be a reserve currency, I think, is right. I think they'd like it to be among a mix. They want to make sure that when Secretary Pompeo issues the sanctions against the Iranian leadership, that there is a way to purchase Iranian oil that we don't have the capacity to either seize, understand, or impact. And so I do think these digital currencies, separate from Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, are something you'll see more countries go to. The United States has a project where we're working on it too, but we will be slow off the gate. It has lots of implications for us here at home. And my guess is that we will not be the leader in this forefront, where an authoritarian regime like China sees nearly all upside from having the capacity to issue currency or take away currency from people who act in ways that are inconsistent with Xi Jinping thought.
No, absolutely. You think of one of the things that gives folks freedom is the ability to walk in with a $100 bill or some type of currency and buy something without it being tracked. But the Chinese will be able to track every single purchase that everyone makes. Now, we've freely given up that privacy in many ways with Amazon, so there's a record of everything that we purchase these days, it seems like, especially during COVID. But by taking away hard currency that can be used to purchase things, it will give the Chinese Communist Party an enormous measure of control over the Chinese people, which and every time they have an opportunity for more control, they'll take it. And as Peter pointed out and the Secretary pointed out, this is another big step along with facial recognition to have a total surveillance society. They'll know every single thing that you
on some level, it is really an extraordinary sociological political experiment with no real 20th century precedent. I mean, there are ways that probably Stalin was still worse than Xi and probably killed more people, but just the degree of hooks that you have into people is just extraordinary. It's sort of like the government's in your innermost core, and it's completely out. It's like the God of St. Augustine. It's like totally outside you, totally inside you, knows everything about you. It's
No, can you imagine how this will factor into the social credit score?
Omniscient,
Yeah.
omnimalevolent.
Yeah, no,
Makes the Stasi look like amateurs.
No, and the social credit score when you tie in the currency to everything else,
what you're
it's
spending
gonna
money on and everything.
Quite something to behold.
I've never heard the term omni-malevolent before. Dr. Shadlow, Nadia Shadlow, your turn.
Hi, it's great to be here, and hi, Peter. It's so nice to see you. I wanted to ask one question that goes back to your original point when you were discussing AI and its sort of loose equivalent to communism. How do we address that problem set in our own society of AI, the proliferation of surveillance technologies, and essentially setting up an infrastructure or a foundation, an infrastructure for, is nascent, but it's what China has today. And how do we grapple with that? How are you thinking about that today in terms of the US and actually Europe as well? It's a problem there too. Thanks.
Well, it's all, it's probably all these debates we're having that are, versions of this. There's sort of the privacy versus transparency. So transparency is more efficient, but privacy, is an important way in which freedoms are preserved in our societies. And so I think there are a lot of these ways where I would bet on the privacy side, getting a little bit more traction in the years ahead. That somehow things have been pushed already too far into the Chinese communist direction in our own country, where we have maybe a few big tech platforms, a few big companies that know an uncomfortable amount about people, and I think there is going to be some corrective to that in the years ahead. And then at the same time, I think in a military context, we need to just be pushing this, figuring out ways to build semi-autonomous or autonomous weapon systems, and we need to sort of figure out ways to combine cyber and AI, and so there's a military piece where I think we need to be going full steam ahead, and then the larger social one, I'd be more careful.
Alex Wong.
Thanks, Hugh, and good to be with everyone again. And Peter, thanks for joining our group. It's a real privilege. Earlier you touched on the need to continue reforming the defense procurement system to bring applied engineering faster, to bring defense systems faster into our competition with China, and not wait so long. But I'm wondering if your thoughts also stray to basic R&D and how the U.S. government invests in that. Looking at our national labs, looking at the NIH, are they structured in the right way, and are they doing enough to invest in computing sciences, but also material sciences, in nuclear, in the biosciences, to provide that good base for the private sector to continue innovating in applied ways to outrun the Chinese, not just in the defense systems, but also in the wider economy?
Yeah, that's my suspicion is that the basic science, basic research funding is probably even more inefficiently and worse allocated than the applied things, because when you have something applied, you're supposed to get something that works, and you get some tests on how quickly things work. One of the when I looked into the NIH budgets, one of the striking things is that a lot of the breakthroughs are made by somewhat younger scientists. The average age of a scientist who gets a Nobel Prize, they're sort of in their late 30s, early 40s when they make the discoveries where they get a Nobel Prize. And something like maybe 2% of NIH funding goes to scientists under age 40. And it has, if you look at it over the last 30 years, it has gotten, older and old. The median age of scientists getting the funding has gotten older and older. And it's kind of this institutional inertia lock-in. And there's probably something about that you need to always push back on. There's probably something about the peer review process in science that leads to a sort of consensus groupthink, but also very incrementalist kinds of things. And the kinds of things that worked a lot better in the 50s and 60s were where you had one person running DARPA, and he knew the 30 top scientists in the country and just gave them money and they could work on whatever they wanted to. And so I think there are ways that that as science scales, it often becomes less of a science. Big tech. You can think of big tech as something that's very natural. It's unnaturally big. It's unhealthy. It's too strong. But there's something in the nature of tech to be big. Big science is actually an oxymoron, and it's like if you have a science factory, or if you have some sort of giant science, some giant science factory, there's probably not very much science going on at all. And so yes, I think probably there's a whole bunch of things on the basic R&D side where it could be reconfigured in some way that's much better, and then how you do that politically is, again, very, very hard lift.
John Noonan.
Hey, Peter, nice to see you again. So the great lesson of World War II was that the Industrial Revolution, or World War I, excuse me, was that the Industrial Revolution was wedged in the middle of this long century of relative peace between the Napoleonic Wars and then ultimately the Great Wars. And generals had no idea what those technological leaps and things like steam power, precision machinery, chemical processes that led to dynamite and poisonous gas meant for the battlefield. And the results were pretty awful. So we've had arguably 3 industrial revolutions in the years of relative peace between World War II and today, and I emphasize the word relative. There was oil, gas, electric, and nuclear fission, telecom, and computers, and then ultimately, I think where we are now, which is the digital age with fiber optics, satellite communications, cyberspace, et cetera. So I have 2 very different questions for you, and without getting into the viability of photon torpedoes and giant planet-killing space lasers, from your outside perspective as a technologist and an investor, what does the 21st century battlefield look like? And then second, just given the fact that Silicon Valley provides the software backbone or central nervous system for almost all of our critical industry sectors, that's IT, banking, agriculture, power, et cetera, how do we reduce our exposure to Chinese and foreign influence in big tech, where they could potentially build backdoors into all of these critical sectors that are required for the survival of our country and ultimately the continuity of government? Thank you.
Wow, well, you've done a great job articulating the question, and that's probably why it's very, very hard to answer. It's been 75 years since the end of World War II, 76 years, and so I suspect that if you had a war on a global scale, that we have really no model for quite what would happen. I think in World War I, in some ways we had it was prefigured by the Civil War in the U.S. and people just didn't pay attention to that. So there are probably things one could be paying attention to, way things have shifted. And I think the last time aircraft were used, where there was an actual battle between competing aircraft, military aircraft, was between Israel and Syria in 1982. So I don't think we've had combat between aircraft in close to 40 years. There was just the drone war in Armenia, where Azerbaijan used the drones very effectively. So I do think we should be paying very careful attention to what's going on, what's being used. But it's very, very weird. If you just have sort of basic division, maybe you have conventional weapons, we have in cyber, we have a shooting war with Russia and China. It's all-out war, and then we have all these nuclear weapons, which I assume never get used, or it's unthinkable. But so you have like these 3 completely different kinds of weapon system. One, we have a shooting war, the conventional war, we don't really know what would happen, and then the nuclear war, we don't even have people thinking about it anymore. It was a thing to think about nuclear deterrence strategy in the 50s and 60s. I think the game theory doesn't actually make any sense anymore. It's like the North Korea problem, where it's like if you actually think about it rationally, we should just be bombing them, or you have to stop them now, or and then maybe you treat him as a cartoon villain and you ignore it, and that's actually good, but then that doesn't work. Nothing makes sense, But so I think even if you just think about those systems and how they would actually interact if you had a major confrontation with China, it's really hard to model out.
Mr. Secretary, does anyone sit around and think about that? What the next battlefield looks like?
Oh yeah, there's lots of folks working on this. Office of Net Assessment, panicky people down on the bowels of the State Department. Yeah, there are a big piece of the U.S. government working their way through it, but I think Peter's point is well taken. It is so complex, and you don't know how it will unfold.
But how, for example, just focus. How do people actually think about the nuclear weapons vis-a-vis China? We have massive advantage in nuclear weapons, but if we never use them, it doesn't count.
They literally have simulations that try and take into account how people they often assume rationality. Sometimes they'll try and turn the rationality switch off and say, what happens if someone makes a really bad decision knowingly, knowing that it may impact them, and what their relative value sets are. But your point's very well taken. It becomes really complicated really fast. You didn't mention the other space, which may well get us into those 3 spaces, which is the information war, which is so confusing and can move so quickly. And the capacity for nations now to act in ways in the information space that didn't have. We didn't know what was going on the battlefields of the Somme, right? We did for weeks. The information battle space is now so central to how this will unfold that it gets the variables quickly overwhelm the capacity for modelers to think their way through this. And so they try and do it in bite-sized chunks and make big assumptions and iterate.
We war game these things. I mean, we do these war games, pretty regularly, and there's a cottage industry, and some of them are very well run. But the problem with the war games is what Mike just pointed out, is you introduce so many different variables. It used to be a little easier to do a tabletop, if you were just moving ships or aircraft or that sort of thing around. But once you start introducing cyber, information, space, and all of a sudden, the homeland becomes at risk, maybe because it's a cyber attack, not a long-range bomber from China, but a cyber attack on an electrical grid.
Right. It's all these asymmetric responses.
It's very, very complicated.
So maybe to concretize a little bit, if China invades Taiwan, what actually happens? Do we bomb the Straits of Hormuz? Do we cut off the oil? Do we just lose? Is there some, do we use tactical nukes?
Yeah, so I think there's reasons presidents don't answer that question for an awfully long time. No president's ever said, in the event that this happens, I will, in response to A, I will do B.
Mm-hmm.
There's strategic ambiguity
Right.
as the concept to try and avoid just exactly that day. I think a lot depends on two things. One, who is in charge the day that happens, that leader, and the conditions that leader has set, and the capacity for that leader to think through the ramifications and to quickly have prepared himself or herself for that moment and to understand the attendant risks. And second, can that person at that point in time marshal the world for a response that is broader, that is not just a U.S.-China response, but a response that is more holistic and more complete, has the capacity to at least convince the Chinese that wherever they are along that way, that deterrence can be restored quickly. And in the event that it can't be, you've seen these war games too, it escalates rather quickly and it gets very confusing. The information gets very confusing very quickly as well.
And we have to keep in mind what a strategic coup it would be if the Chinese could take over, not just because of Taiwan, not just because of the chips and the factories and the foundries, but Taiwan sits as the cork in the middle of the Pacific. If
First island chain.
whatever country, and it goes beyond that. I mean, the entire Pacific is wide open if China takes Taiwan. I mean, it splits Northern Asia. Japan are allies there. South Korea. It splits them from Australia and New Zealand and the Philippines and Thailand are their treaty allies. But the entire Pacific becomes a superhighway all the way out to the Aleutians and Hawaii. And look, we've seen this movie once before. And
What's your best guess when they're going to take a crack at it, or if and when they do it?
Look, my view is that peace through strength works. I mean, we're at the Nixon Library, and peace through strength is more associated with Ronald Reagan and the Simi Valley Library. But the point is, if we have a strong enough deterrent, if we continue to invest in the Pentagon and in our forces, if our allies do the same, and that includes the Taiwanese, our partners there, if they turn themselves into a porcupine that would be difficult to digest, I think it's possible to deter the Chinese from doing that. But look, I've always said weakness is provocative. And if we show weakness to the Chinese or they perceive weakness on our part, it could actually provoke them into attacking Taiwan. And then it leads to all of the myriad of problems that the Secretary pointed out and potentially war. So look, the best way to prevent war is to be prepared for it. And that's the policy we have to pursue.
John Noonan, you had a follow-up?
Let me run one theory by you guys here. So I'm pretty surprised by the crackdown China has done in Hong Kong. I always thought they could wait till 2047. They didn't have to do anything quite this drastic. And my mental model was that every time the Politburo discussed having a total crackdown in Hong Kong, there was someone in the back of the room who raised their hand and said, we can't do that because we have to convince Taiwan to reunify with China. And this time that person was told, shut up, they're never going to do it peacefully anyway. And is there a way to read the Hong Kong thing as, the Chinese timetable on Taiwan has moved up?
Well, after Hong Kong, the idea that the Taiwanese would gladly or without being coerced enter into some sort of one country, two systems. I mean, that's never going to happen. They saw what's happened in Tibet. They saw what's happened in Hong Kong now, and they've seen what happened in Xinjiang. So, I mean, the idea that the Taiwanese would voluntarily surrender their liberty and their freedom and their democracy to the Chinese Communist Party is, I think that idea is past, and I think the Chinese have recognized that. And so, the only way for a reunification will be a coerced reunification, in my view, or a total change in China, which I don't think the CCP is contemplating.
Remember, too, they have elections there. Right. The Chinese Communist Party's capacity to influence elections that are held on Taiwan is real. And so it may not be that it takes carriers and missiles and bombs and threats. It may just be that over time you can apply such coercive pressure, military, economic, diplomatic, that you can convince enough people there that it's just not worth the candle. Remember, Taiwan's never been part of China. This thing's stitched together. Right? When we think of the historic China, Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, this is stitched together. The People's Republic of China itself is a figment of the Communist Party's imagination, and they know it. And they're trying desperately to find the tools they can best to consolidate their own power internally. And one of the tools of that is external power and external threats as well.
John Noonan?
Yeah, Peter, just to reiterate the second part of my question, I think you've warned very starkly about companies like Google, who are, I think your words, forgive me if I'm misquoting you, more or less infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party. Silicon Valley provides the backbone and the central nervous system for most of the critical industries and sectors in the United States. And so what's our exposure, just given the fact that Silicon Valley is purportedly infiltrated by a deep and intrusive Chinese communist presence?
Yeah, again, I left it a little bit ambiguous. I was unclear on how much is actual, United Front Chinese communist agents, how much is useful idiots, how much it's people, surrendered in advance, or, there's sort of a lot of different constituencies. Look, I think we have to. I think the thing I would say is we have to just keep putting a certain amount of pressure on Silicon Valley, and we need to call companies like Google out on working on AI with China, communist China, and not with the U.S. military. I think we should be putting a lot of pressure on Apple with its whole labor force supply chain on the iPhone manufacturing in China, and so I think that's one way we sort of do a little bit of what Robert was talking about earlier, where you sort of there's obviously some crazy double standard where labor laws don't apply there, but they do apply here, and there are all sorts of crazy double standards, and you just need to call people out on that relentlessly. I think the cybersecurity issue is is simply a mess as far as I can tell, where there's basically the basic problem is that cyber is one of these places where offense works a lot better than defense, and I don't quite know what you do. I'm often amazed. I sort of assume that so much stuff has been hacked into in one way or another. I'm sort of amazed the stuff doesn't get used in more ways. It's like people should be getting blackmailed, bribed. All sorts of crazy things should be going on all over the place, and somehow. All the data that I assume has actually already been exfiltrated. It's actually weird. It doesn't get used more. I don't even know why that is. But my model is that cyber is just a disaster, and it's actually amazing that it doesn't manifest itself more.
Christian Whiten.
Thank you, Hugh. Peter, speaking of getting sort of tougher on Silicon Valley or holding them to account. The Supreme Court recently decided to vacate its order that former President Trump, or while he was president, couldn't block people on Twitter. But the more interesting development was a concurring opinion from Clarence Thomas, the Associate Justice, who basically said that companies like Twitter and others should be regulated or could be regulated as common carriers, basically implying that they're sort of a natural monopoly and that their attempts to censor people, which I think we know sort of tend to focus much more on conservatives, could in fact be limited, could be regulated by the federal government or by state governments in the same way we regulate utilities. Do you think that is sort of the future of where we're going with Twitter and other platforms like it?
Well, it's look, I'm on the Facebook board, so I have to always be careful what I say here. But deplatforming President Trump, 3 months ago was really quite extraordinary, and that I think there has been a lot of deplatforming of conservatives, and I always think that the actual censorship that people talk about is just the tip of the iceberg, and the real problem is the downranking. So one of the top Google executives used to always say 5-6 years ago, we never censor anybody, we just downrank people. And the downranking was actually the far more insidious way to sort of tilt the playing field of the discourse. But then there's been outright censorship, outright deplatforming, and when you do it with the President of the United States, that does feel like you've really crossed some kind of Rubicon where, and I'm not sure you declare war on half the country, but maybe a third, 40% of the country. That seems really, really crazy. When you have Angela Merkel and Obrador from Mexico saying that the tech platforms have been too anti-Trump, too mean to Mr. Trump, that tells you you've probably really overreached.
Matt Pottinger, you had a comment?
Yeah, just thanks a lot, Hugh. One thing, going back to the conversation about Taiwan, that we should remember is that we're talking about all the different domains that China fights in: information, cyber, as well as military and the rest. One of the strongest tools we have is our dominance in finance, capital markets, and the reserve currency status of the dollar that we talked about. When it comes to Taiwan, one thing that we should be reminding China about is that if they were to try to coercively annex Taiwan, we could shut down their entire banking system. So in other words, we can we could sanction all their major banks. We can bring a lot to that fight as a way to deter them that is non-military, but could actually carry even more profound costs for China's economy. So I just wanted to add that idea.
Oh, thank you. Morgan Ortegas.
Thanks. Thanks, Peter. Great to be with you. One of the things that struck me in your book that I really liked is you talked about at the very beginning how when you're innovating, if you are, or starting a new company, if you're trying to make the next Facebook or the next Google, that you're already behind, that you're not doing anything innovative. And I was wondering, this is a really big, grand question, but I was wondering if there's a way to apply this to foreign policy, to what we do. I know the Secretary could probably concur that foreign policy and what we do at the State Department hasn't changed in probably 100 years. There hasn't been a lot of innovation. So is there a way to apply what you've done in the business world and innovating and being entrepreneurial to how we look at foreign policy going forward, especially hoping that some of us will be working again in 4 or 8 years?
Well, I think that's a better question for Robert or Mike. I guess my sort of pro-innovation bias is always that people are somehow too anchored on the past, and in business they're too anchored on doing things that worked in the past or copying some model that, building a new search engine was the right thing to do for Google in 1999. It's probably not the right thing to do today because it's very hard to compete against Google by doing the exact same thing they're doing. And then I think the foreign policy mistake that I suspect gets made, a great deal and over again, is to somehow think that we're still at some point in the past. And so, so maybe one version of the mistake that was made with China was to think that it was going to be like the Soviet Union, and then the Berlin Wall came down in '89, and then surely something like that was going to happen in China. We're sort of anchored on the 1980s and used that as a frame. And then of course the dynamic thing where China can also look at the history and read the history and say, well, that's exactly what's not going to happen. We're going to have perestroika but no glasnost, and we can sort of also innovate in certain ways and avoid that. And then there's sort of a version where it's like, well, is this like 1914 or is this is this 1989 or what year is this? And I always say it's actually just 2021, and that's not very helpful, but maybe that's where we should start.
Monica Crowley.
Hugh, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, Ambassador, so good to see you. And Peter, thank you so much for doing this today. How do you see companies and platforms like TikTok, Chinese-owned, globally hugely popular, and yet a national security threat to the United States? Obviously, the discussions surrounding TikTok's future are ongoing, and we don't have a determination yet about that. But How do you see this going forward? Should the United States have an overarching uniform policy to deal with platforms and companies like this, or should we be dealing with them on an ad hoc basis? Thank you.
Well, obviously, a uniform policy is always better, but I often worry that that's slow. It's like, I think multilateralism is always better than unilateralism in theory, and then in practice, multilateralism is often an excuse that you have if you want to not do anything. And if you say we need to do it multilaterally, maybe that's one way of saying we need to do it for real, and maybe it's a way of saying we don't need to do it at all. And so, yeah, I think I would like to just see sort of fast, flexible response. You try to do whatever you need to do to stop the house from burning down, and then you try to formalize it as fast as possible. I think the thing that's problematic about TikTok is that it again has this sort of incredible exfiltration of data about people. You're sort of creating this incredibly privacy invading map of a large part of the population of the Western world, and then I think it's also it's again one of these sort of odd things where it's a fairly powerful application of AI in a certain sense, where it's innovative, and they figured out ways to make it especially addictive, and they figure out what videos to show you, so that if you watch these, you'll just keep watching more and more. But it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that if you shut it down, it would be this economic catastrophe either. I think India banned TikTok, and there were sort of less good alternatives that popped up that were local, and I don't think it was like a tremendous loss. And so I think how to talk about it is often quite tricky, and we need to figure out a way where we can say that it's both this problematic AI technology on one level, and then on another level it's not that valuable a technology at all, and for which reason we can probably do without it.
Let me just pitch in here. When we were thinking about TikTok, two things that you reminded me of. One, our tools weren't very good to respond to it, right? Our tools are the historic tools that we've had for all these years of how do you stop someone if they're bringing in contraband on a ship that's coming across the sea, right? These export models, how do you do? They're really not made fit for purpose for this world, and so we struggled. So we worked around them, worked through it, got as creative as we could to figure out the toolkit that would best address that problem set as quickly as we could. The commercial response was much greater than the public response. Your point, the Indian foreign minister told me when they banned, I can't remember the ultimate number, but dozens.
I think it was 150 ultimately.
The first group that they did, it was a matter of weeks before there were, call them knockoffs, if you will, but Indian-made, Indian-manufactured proxies for the applications of the software that had been gone. It may not have been at the same level, it may not have been as perfect, but the people of India were reasonably satisfied. And so I think policymakers are often very concerned that if they take something away, that there'll be this huge political backlash from something that's as popular as TikTok. My sense is that innovators and capitalists will figure a solution to at least meet the demand, if that demand is in fact real.
Yes.
Okay, we got three more before we run out of time. Lonnie Chan.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks for spending some time with us this evening. Curious to get your thoughts on something that I think China has done relatively well, actually, over the last, 15 or 20 years, and that's infiltrate international organizations. I think they've done a tremendous job, for example, of seizing leadership of the World Health Organization, and we've seen how that rot has spread and, in fact, gotten in the way of us discovering the origins of COVID-19, along with other potential problems. Other organizations, I think they've been successful at infiltrating as well. Finally, during the last couple of years, under the leadership of many of the people on this seminar, we've started to push back on China and started to say, look, you can't do this and can't have the playing field to yourself anymore. But is that really the right long-term solution here? Are these sort of international organizations, this model of international collective action, is it the right one to deal in areas like intellectual property, for example, healthcare? Or do we need to go to something fundamentally different? To Peter's point about innovating, is this an area where we need to be more innovative, to think outside the box? And if so, what's the right answer?
Why don't you take it?
One short comment on that, Lonnie, and it's a great question. It's something that we worked on very hard. Mike's team and our team at the NSC was to number one, try and make sure that there were candidates that believed in and free men and women and free markets, at least competing for these international organization top slots. But it's not just a top slot; it's the deputy, it's the functionaries, even to the point the interns. The Chinese were funding massive number of Chinese interns at international organizations that were cash strapped, and those interns would learn and would have the first crack at jobs. So, we need to compete there. We need to compete effectively. There are quota systems at the UN. We weren't even filling the quota for Americans at the UN, and there are plenty of young men and women in this country that are constantly asking me, the Secretary, Peter, I'm sure, how do I get in government? I want to do foreign policy. I want to do foreign affairs. One of the ways to do it, it's how I got started, was at an international organization. And so we need to make sure Americans are in those places. But going to your second question of can they ever be effective? And they're generally not super effective. And we can pick out examples, Gulf One, and a few other examples, but there are very few where international organizations have mobilized to effectively protect us. We need to have groupings of like-minded countries. And so one of the things that we worked on and that Mike worked on very hard was the Quad, where we brought Japan, India, Australia together with the United States to address common issues in the Indo-Pacific. So I think pulling together multilateral coalitions of like-minded countries that may not necessarily be institutionalized, but at least are there on an ad hoc basis, is a way for us to harness the value of working with our allies and friends and partners to address specific threats, and not necessarily getting caught up in the quagmire of the UN or other UN specialized agencies. So I think it's two parts. One, we need to compete and play there, but two, we also need to put together our own groups of like-minded countries to address some of these global issues. Mike, do you have any thoughts here?
There's a couple more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are designed not to work at this point, and it's amazing people still think that they work at all. There's sort of, I think the New Dealers had this fantasy after 1945 that you create these organizations and they'd be sort of American, not quite controlled,
Sure.
but heavily influenced. And the way I understand the history is, I think already by the time of the Marshall Plan was already a workaround.
Yeah.
And it was basically, it didn't actually go through any of the multinational post-World War II organizations because they were already deemed ineffective by the time of the Marshall Plan.
We should never accept Chinese participation as their desire to make these things functional.
Right.
It is an instrumentality for them. It is they're not a rights-respecting nation, and they don't join these organizations to make them better and effective.
I'm going to go to Kimberly Reed, then Mary Kissel, then Chris Cox to wrap it up. Kimberly?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. I just finished tenure as the first woman chairman of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. And I really want to thank you for all you're doing in Silicon Valley, but also for sending some great colleagues of yours into USG. Enjoyed working with them. Congress, including Congressman Gallagher and Congressman Waltz, who are on the China Task Force, they were really instrumental in recognizing that financing was key in competition with China. And Congress changed the law last year to allow Ex-Im to match the rate terms and conditions that the PRC would be offering foreign purchasers around the world for products that we all care about, including transformational exports. I'm just wondering, you wrote your great book in 2014, and you've been involved with what's happening in our government as we are hearing today. Any thoughts on what else government should be doing with Silicon Valley when it comes to competition with China?
Well, I think it's a multifaceted thing. I don't think we should be super dogmatic. So I'm probably always sort of very free market libertarian, and the dogmatic libertarian thing would be that you shouldn't have an export-import bank because it involves all these government subsidies of loans. But if in a world where we don't really have free trade and we don't have a balanced playing field, it makes a lot of sense to have something like the Ex-Im Bank and to actually expand it. And so I think yes, I think we should be trying a lot of different things, a lot of different areas, and we should try to be practical, not dogmatic on it.
So let me go over to Mary Kissel again. Mary?
Hey, thanks. Peter, I've just taken some notes here. So they're in a tech war with us. We're not with them. They've infiltrated our campuses, our labs, and our international organizations. They have a big data collection advantage. They'll use unethical means to win. Our Defense Department is a mess. We're riven by a privacy debate, and they're ahead in crypto, threatening our reserve currency status. Are you optimistic here? I mean, how do you feel after, coming to a list like that?
Look, I think there are a lot of I think something about the format of this sort of conversation always pushes you to be a little bit more negative and stress all the problems that there are. I would say, on the I think if it was a fight between the U.S. and China, I think that's a tough one for the U.S. But I don't think that's going to be the dynamic. I think it's going to be China against the whole world, and it is. One metaphor I've heard for China is that it's a weirdly autistic country where everything is sort of drawn to the center, and maybe they can strong arm Taiwan, but I think it's profoundly uncharismatic, and I think that's a very big limitation they have, and then even if it looks like they're winning, they're the rising power, I think that will have the effect of scaring a lot of other countries. It's like the U.S. has challenges, but we like countries like Vietnam or India or Japan, or Taiwan. They're not threatened by the U.S. at this point, and they're going to be much more naturally on the U.S. side and on the anti-China side there. And so there's something about the China dynamic that's been extremely, zero sum in a way that I would say is sort of borderline autistic. And
Peter, I'm going to interject a question before I go to Christopher to wrap it up. Since it's China versus the world, should the world be going to China in 2022 for the Olympics? The State Department this evening announced that they were backing away from their earlier story today about having a boycott, and I'd love to hear what the ambassador and the secretary think about that too. Should the world descend on Beijing?
Well, I think it's dangerous to make predictions, but my prediction is that it will not. I mean, maybe our athletes will go. I don't think you're going to have many political leaders from the Western world, and it will, maybe it's not a full boycott like the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, but I think it will. It'll be anticlimactic. It'll be, the turnout, the validation for China will be, it'll be as bad as Sochi in 2014. That's even with no boycott.
We'll talk about this next month, but Mr. Secretary, you want to give us a preview of what you're going to say?
I don't think we should go. I don't think we should have any American go participate in the Genocide Olympics. Just how you would send your child there to compete when if they said so much as, boy, the food's bad here today, you could end up in a Chinese prison for an awfully long time. That's a modest overstatement. It seems like an awful lot of risk. I think she knows that. He might well not take anybody and hold them, but it's not a risk that I would suggest one of my family members, if they were good enough athletes, ought to take. I hope we'll convince the IOC not to hold them there and find another solution. We figured out how to move an all-star game pretty quickly, Hugh. Maybe we can figure out how to move an Olympics.
Mr. Ambassador, you want to add anything?
Well, they've revoked for Mike and Pottinger and myself. They've revoked our invitation, so I don't think we'll be going under any circumstances. And I agree. It goes back to this double standard that we spoke about earlier. It's amazing how quickly corporate America can justify a move from Atlanta to Denver, but is perfectly prepared to continue to support events in China. So it's an area of real concern. And as the former hostage envoy and having dealt with some cases in China with the Secretary's full support, he and I have probably seen this movie play out more times than we'd like, and it is somewhat frightening. And the Chinese seem to be getting into the hostage game, or at least the detainee game, with the two Michaels, the Spaver and Kovrig, the Canadians, the way the Iranians have played the game for many years. So I think anyone's got to be very concerned and has to think twice about why you're going to China, what you're going to do there, and if you want to take the risk of having an extended stay as a guest of Xi Jinping.
Christopher Cox, last comment or question to you.
Sure. Thanks, Hugh, and thank you everyone for this wonderful night. My question really is to everyone on the panel. During the Cold War, we had benchmarks of how we were doing against the Russians, against the Soviets. And we also had a very clear ending. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, it was clear we'd won. When the Berlin Wall fell, it was clear that we'd won. In an AI arms race with China, are there similar benchmarks that will show how we are doing in the years to come? And at the end of the day, what will determine whether we've won or lost?
Well, I think AI is a very difficult one to benchmark, but I think I think one of the big flashpoints the last few years has been the Huawei 5G piece, and that's been fairly straightforward. You just go down the list of countries, what are they doing, and you can sort of see how we're doing, how successful we are at holding the line there. I think there's going to be sort of some question about the semiconductor boycotts, how effective those are, and will China be able to ramp up its production, get around that? So I think that can be that one will be benchmarked, pretty straightforwardly as well. AI is always this crazy buzzword. It means all these different things, and so maybe that's even a term one has to be careful to use for that reason.
Go ahead, Robert.
I think just two things. One is how many Confucius Institutes continue to be allowed to participate in some of these Chinese student organizations that are controlled by the CCP and keep other students of Chinese descent from participating in U.S. universities with free speech. So we'll have to see how that goes, their influence operations. But starting with those, because those are something easy to benchmark. If the institutes are closed and removed from campus, that's something that I think we'll see as useful. And I think the other big fight, and this is something that Larry Kudlow and I ran from the White House, and that's preventing U.S. investment in China. I mean, we've literally had U.S. Investment dollars going to Chinese companies that are building ships and aircrafts and munitions and tanks that could ultimately be used against either ourselves or our allies or partners in the region. So I think if we can cut off the flow of investment and limit the overt influences, I'm not talking about the covert influence, but just the overt influence, I think those are two benchmarks that the Biden administration has a chance to gain some traction on and show that we're going to stand up to the Chinese. And let me say one other thing. I think Secretary Pompeo, Mike, hasn't gotten the recognition that he deserves for a number of the measures that he took in his last week in office, but especially in labeling what was happening to the Uyghurs, what is happening to the Uyghurs as genocide. It took a lot of courage. He was the person with the statutory authority to make that decision. There were a lot of people that were angry about it, both overseas and in this country, especially on Wall Street.
On the fourth floor State Department.
At the State Department. It took a lot of courage, but history is going to treat Mike very well for having made that decision, just like it's treated folks well who made the similar calls in the 30s and 40s, but were not popular at the time. So I just want to make that comment before turning the mic over to you.
That's very nice, Robert. It's an important question. I don't know that there's a singular answer. In the end, Xi Jinping is afraid of liberty and sovereignty and the rules-based order. It's his enemy, and we will know who ultimately wins this by which ideas dominate the next 10, 20, 40 years. Are they a set of Western ideas? Or are they a set of understandings that flow from the authoritarian regime in China? There is a global component to this. I will take credit for what President Trump allowed us, those of us on this call who served his administration, to do. We had a chance for the first time to go around the world and make the case for why the threat from that central underpinning, that central idea that the Chinese Communist Party, this party, right, not a country, a party puts forward in an attempt to dominate the world. And so ultimately this will be fought out as an ideological struggle as much as anything else, and we need to remind ourselves of our founding and our history and the power that flows from that. We need to be unashamed about talking about that, whether we're on a college campus or at a PTA meeting or at the United Nations. In every one of those fora, we need to put forward the central thesis that our liberty and our ideas about freedom, and Peter's talking about being a libertarian, that's my background as well, right? The capacity for individual human beings to engage in rational activity in the way that they prefer to do so. That's how we'll know if we've ultimately won or not.